Hi everyone, nice to see you all again. Welcome back to the channel. In this video I'm going to be talking about my studies of Japanese. More specifically, I'm going to be talking about whether or not the quality of my spoken Japanese is still important to me, whether I'm trying to improve it or not, and my general attitude towards my Japanese. To skip to the conclusion, the ongoing, very gradual deterioration of my spoken Japanese isn't really very important to me, and I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about why that should be the case. Now don't get me wrong, of course my Japanese is important to me. I spent a lot of time and energy and effort learning Japanese, and if I were to get whacked over the head today and wake up tomorrow morning realizing that I couldn't speak Japanese anymore, you can be sure that I would be pretty peeved. That said, my exposure to Japanese these days is really pretty limited. Because I teach Japanese, I have to speak it to some extent in my lessons. Some of my more intermediate students like to speak it to some extent, and that is something that I have to do. That means that I think about Japanese and that I think in Japanese fairly regularly, so I don't imagine that it's going to deteriorate that much. Having said that, I can't expect my Japanese ever to get any better again unless something changes quite radically in my life. And I thought it would be interesting to think and talk a little bit about why that should be the case and why it doesn't bother me. I started studying Japanese at university when I was 19 years old, and for a period of about 7 years, Japan and Japanese between them were basically what I did and what I thought about. Like I said, I studied Japanese at university. When I graduated, I went to live in Japan. Before I graduated, I must have gone out probably 2 or 3 times for a period of between 2 and 4 months each time. Anyway, I finished my degree, I moved to Japan, I got a job translating Japanese into English in a substantially Japanese-speaking environment. I had a lot of Japanese friends. I socialized predominantly, though not entirely, in Japanese. And these activities were activities that I engaged in, and I'm including here my studies of Japanese at university. These activities were activities that I engaged in for about 7 years altogether. That's quite a long time. But then I left for reasons that I won't go into. There's nothing that exciting going on, but for reasons that I won't go into, I left Japan and I went back to Britain. And over the next probably 4 years, something like that, I did my best to stay in contact with people. I went out to Japan for a couple of trips over the next few years, but gradually I started to lose contact with the country, with the language, and with the people that I had known there. With the best will in the world, connections just weaken over time, and there isn't that much you can do about it. Eventually I realized that Japan, which for a period of time in my life had felt like home, had really receded emotionally. Its importance to me emotionally, its importance to me as a place that I might go back to live in again one day, had really diminished, had really dwindled down to, I won't say nothing, but to a surprisingly low level. Once a certain amount of time had passed after I left, and we're talking about a good few years here, but nonetheless, after a certain amount of time had passed, I realized that Japan was just another country to me, one that I had happened to live in at some point in time in my life, and whose language I happened to be able to speak quite well. No matter what efforts you might think you're going to make to stay in contact with people when you leave a country, the reality is that it's very hard to stay in contact with people in the long term. I today am in contact with literally 2 people that I used to know in Japan, 2 Japanese people that is, and I used to know a lot of people there. I've really just fallen out of touch with pretty much everybody. Yes, it's easy to tell yourself that that won't happen to you. But when I quit my job and moved back to Britain, I was 26, and today I am 46. I don't mean it's my birthday today, I mean now I am 46. That's 20 years, that's a hell of a long time, and all sorts of things can happen over that sort of time frame, things that you would not have predicted. You just can't know how life is going to pan out, how you're going to change. You don't know what it means to be 46 when you're 26, put it like that. Life moves on, things change, you have new experiences, you meet new people, and the old life that was so overwhelmingly important to you at the time, you realize that it started to recede a bit. It's in the rearview mirror now. The last time I was in Japan, if memory serves, was 2008. I was there for about 6 weeks, I think. That was an extended trip. Now, I have to be honest, even the desire to go back to Japan for a trip has largely dissipated. And to be honest, I've done pretty much everything, realistically speaking, that I could do in Japan, including traveling, because I've been to lots of places out there. I noticed something strange Maybe not that strange, but when I left Japan, if I stumbled upon a Japanese person somewhere in Britain or wherever I happened to be, part of my brain would say, oh, they're Japanese. In principle, we could go and talk to them. Wouldn't that be cool? But over the years, that just fell away. When I see a Japanese person now in Britain or in Spain, where I live at the moment, I just register that they're Japanese, assuming I can figure out that they're Japanese. I just register that in the same way that I'd register that a Korean person was Korean or that a Vietnamese person was Vietnamese. There wouldn't be any particular significance to it. I wouldn't think, oh, cool, I could go and talk to them. So being able to speak Japanese isn't a particularly useful skill for me now, the way my life has worked out. Don't get me wrong, learning Japanese and living in Japan, these were huge and pivotal experiences for me, really formative experiences, but my life has just taken me in a certain direction and speaking Japanese isn't actually particularly useful. So when I perceive, as I very often do perceive, the flaws and the imperfections in my spoken Japanese, to be honest, I don't care. I suppose I'm influenced in this sense by the nature of the deterioration that I can see in my Japanese. I've never really noticed any significant difference in my ability to understand Japanese, whether in written form or in spoken form. What I don't understand in Japanese, I almost certainly would not have understood back when I lived in Japan all those years ago. Maybe in some respects my comprehension has improved a little bit. You pick up new words here and there if you watch some anime. That kind of thing does happen, of course. What deteriorates most obviously is production, which is to say speaking in normal English. But the deterioration really is to do with active vocabulary and range of expression. I don't feel any deterioration in terms of my ability to put Japanese sentences together in real time. When I get stuck, when I stumble, when I start humming and hawing, I do that because I just don't have the words in any available place in my brain that I can rip them out of into consciousness to use in conversation. Just don't have the right words, just don't have the right expressions. I once had an 8-year period during which I spoke Japanese literally once for one evening in Paris when I was meeting up with an old friend of mine who happened to live in Paris. On that occasion, there were probably a few moments where I stumbled over something that I wouldn't have stumbled over in the past. There were probably a few moments when I didn't feel as comfortable as I would have in the past, with respect to the Japanese, that is. But on the whole, I think I acquitted myself pretty well. I don't think there was any substantial difference between the way I was speaking and the way I'd spoken previously when I lived in Japan, especially once you get warmed up. Especially once you feel the juices flowing again. To be honest, I don't feel that much difference. And that's pretty good, bearing in mind that I just had a 4-year layoff from actually speaking Japanese. A few years ago, I went through a period of maybe a couple of years when I studied Japanese fairly actively again. Over a period of, like I said, a couple of years, I probably put about 1,000 years. Over that period of a couple of years, I probably put about 1,000 hours into Japanese. And that's a pretty significant amount of time to put into anything over 2 years. Was it worth it? Probably not. Now I regret it. Because when you have the type of relationship with Japanese that I have, studying like that is like pumping up a balloon that's just going to start deflating as soon as you stop pumping it. So I started to study, my vocabulary started to improve, my range of expression started to improve a bit. That was quite a pleasant feeling. And then I stopped and I could gradually feel myself going back to where I'd been in the first place, back to my baseline post-Japan level of Japanese. Fortunately for me, that baseline level of Japanese is a pretty high level. It's a pretty respectable baseline. It's some sort of pretty solid C1 level of ability, I'd say. And I'm pretty comfortable with that. So I would say that my spoken Japanese is probably still better than maybe 97, 98% of all the Westerners who ever study Japanese seriously. I'm not talking about everyone who studies it, I'm talking about everyone who studies it seriously. With that level of Japanese, I feel quite content. I studied Japanese pretty intensively for 4 years in an academic environment, and there were a couple of trips to Japan spread out through that period of 4 years, if you like. Then I left university, went to live in Japan, lived there for, let's say, 3 years in total. And I didn't study Japanese during that time. What I learned, I just picked up by osmosis. You can pick a lot up by osmosis, but there's nothing really that beats serious, dedicated study. So that means that I had 4 years, roughly, of dedicated study and 3 years of picking stuff up, like I said, by osmosis. Bearing in mind that there are people who study Japanese, or any language, but we're talking about Japanese, right? Bearing in mind that there are people who study Japanese in a dedicated fashion for 20 or 30 years, my exposure to Japanese was not quite as deep, not quite as profound as I thought it was at the time. Having said that, it was still pretty significant, and I got pretty good, and I'm pretty happy with that. Over the last several years, my attention has shifted to other languages. Most obviously, in terms of the amount of time I've spent working on them, Russian and Mandarin Chinese, though I've also spent quite a lot of time studying Spanish too. And those languages are now a part of my life in various different ways, but certainly in ways that Japanese is not, and that it never will be again. But I think that's okay. Japan was a good part of my life. Studying Japanese was a good part of my life. It changed my life for the better. Actively maintaining my Japanese would be a waste of time, I think, partly because I have lots of other things to do, and partly because, as I just explained, if you're not prepared to maintain a language like that in perpetuity, then arguably you're better off not doing it when you perceive the rate of deterioration of that language to be very low, as it is with my Japanese. If I ever need to get back into the old Japanese, seriously, if I ever feel the need to improve, then I will do that, and I know that I'll start to improve again pretty quickly. But at the moment, it's just not worth it, and as long as I can speak Japanese substantially better than my students can, as long as I can teach them new stuff and challenge them a bit and test them and put them in an environment in which they can try and speak the bits of Japanese that they know, then I'm pretty happy to speak Japanese at the level I speak it at. Feel free to like, comment and subscribe if there was anything in this video that you found useful. It would be interesting to hear other people's stories about how they do or don't maintain a language that they've learned in the long term. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. Ciao, ciao. Bye bye.